If you've been with us for a few weeks, we've been in a series titled People Skills. We've spent 7 weeks really diving into this idea of how can we improve in our interpersonal relationships. We really believe that your relationships with others matter a lot to God. We think God takes it personally, how you treat others. And so we just really dedicated 8 weeks in total. We're wrapping up today to dive in deeper and say, how can we grow closer to God and become more like Him in this area of how we relate to others. And so some of the topics, just to jog your memory, that we've covered, we've talked about offense, overcoming offense. We talked about forgiveness. We've talked about encouragement. We've talked about how to be a good friend to others. We talked about people pleasing and how challenging that is. And we've talked about being present with people. And last Sunday, you talked about criticism, how to overcome those critical people in your life and the criticism that comes your way. And so we wanted to wrap up. It's been a great series. I hope we've enjoyed studying the Word and doing this series. And I hope that you are encouraged and challenged in it just to grow closer to Jesus, be more like Him in the area of your relationships. And so we wanted to wrap up this series with a time of Q&R, question and response. We wanted to know, hey, what are the real things that you're dealing with that we can talk about and address through the lens of Scripture? And so you all set in some great questions.
Yeah,
and
really
we're
good.
hoping to cover like 7 of them today.
We'll see. We'll see how much I talk.
We'll see how much you talk. We'll see how much I talk. Yeah, we'll see how much. But great questions. I really love the heartbeat of a lot of these. Like, you guys want to grow and just be more like Jesus. And so I'm pumped to talk about these.
Yeah, it's going to be fun. So if you're brand new, normally we like open up the Word, we preach, we go through that thing. Today, it's different.
It's a conversation.
We're having conversation.
Yeah.
I think a lot of pastoral ministry happens this way. We're at a dinner table, we're in somebody's house or a coffee shop, and it's just back and forth. And so I like ending the series like this, especially a series like this, where it's like, how do we love one another? How do we forgive one another? How do we do these things? So let's just jump right in. Should I ask you the first question? This is what somebody said. They said, how do I gain confidence to pray for someone in a public setting or a big group without fumbling?
I love this question because just the heart behind it, I can really hear that heart. Like, you want to grow in your confidence in praying for people. How awesome is that? And so the short answer is just pray more. Just do it more, because as you pray more out loud, you will become more confident in your prayer. I think sometimes we feel so intimidated because we're worried about getting every little thing right. Maybe we're worried that our theology is off, or that we're not saying the right thing, or maybe we just get worried and self-conscious about what we're saying when we pray. But I want to just encourage you, pray more. Don't make it weird. If you make it weird, it will be weird. Don't make it weird. Be confident. Assume that people are with you, but also be aware when they're not. And so if you're praying publicly, be in tune with God and the people that you're praying with. And I want to just say, who cares what people think? A little bit. Like, hey, this is what we're called to do. And so there is a point where you are caring more about and believing in the power of the prayer over the people that are listening. Because if you believe in the power of prayer, you really get over yourself and say, I'm talking to an almighty God, and you're having a conversation with Him. And so it kind of takes the pressure off, and you're like, listen, I'm talking to God. Like, who cares if I don't say everything perfectly right? He knows what we're saying.
No, I love that. That's a great answer. I think praying more, and then also just pray out loud, even when you're by yourself.
Yeah.
I think sometimes it's more of just like the habit of doing that. I do that anyway a lot. When I'm by myself, I pray out loud, because otherwise I get really distracted. Because it's easier to multitask in your brain. You can't really multitask. You guys know what I'm talking about, though. But you get distracted so much faster if it's just internal. If I'm praying out loud, I don't know. It's easier. Better practice.
So good. So good. I love Hebrews 4:16. Let us then with confidence draw near to the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in a time of need. I think if you wrap your mind around the power of prayer and that prayer truly changes things, I think it will change your perspective in how how you feel about praying out loud. Because when you get real convicted about how prayer matters, you get over yourself and you say, you know what, this is more important than what others might think or even what I think about myself. And so prayer is our first response. It's not our last resort. And so I would say just do it more, pray, and be confident, and just watch your confidence grow and praying out loud. I love that question.
Yeah, maybe you have a little template in your head, like address God, address a characteristic of who he is. Like we just sang a bunch of characteristics, be like, God, I thank you that you are my provider. Mm-hmm. And then go into talking about, will you provide? Or God, I thank you that you are this, and then pray through that theological point.
Yeah.
That's something I learned from Tim Keller.
I like that.
Yeah.
That's really good.
All right, let's jump into the next one.
Okay,
what is
next
one thing I
question.
can do? This is a broad one. This is a great one. What is one thing I can do to improve my relationships?
I love that. What's one thing? Okay, well, Dan and I were talking about this week, and we came down to kind of this topic. I think one thing that you can do to improve your relationships is grow in humility. I think it will change your relationships, whether it's your marriage, your friendships, your professional relationships with your neighbor. If you grow in humility, your relationships will improve. I love an illustration that you used a bit ago. You said that humility is like the WD-40 to our relationships. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah. Do you guys remember that, some of you? I talked about how I use WD-40 on everything. I did.
He
I used it this morning.
WD-40.
Tim was there.
You used it this morning?
Tim was there.
Stop.
The trailer.
Because we're talking about this?
I mean, it's probably in my mind.
Stop.
But
yeah, he's like, I use it. Okay, but he really does use it a lot.
I love it.
All the time.
It just makes everything
He
move
loves WD-40.
more smoothly. And it does that in our relationships too. Like, it helps smooth out rough areas in our relationships. It helps things move more easily. And it's just a posture we should have. So, this isn't like the one thing. The question is, what is the one thing I can do? But like, this isn't the only thing. This is just one thing that came to our mind. And we were thinking about Philippians 2. It says, do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves, not looking out to your own interests, but each of you to the interests of others. What a practical relationship tip from the Apostle Paul to the Philippian church. Hey, don't just look out for your own interests, look out for the interests of others. Then he says in verse 5, in your relationships with one another. It's like he knew this question way in advance. No, I'm just kidding. In your relationship with others, with one another, have the same mindset as Jesus Christ, who being in the very nature of God, did not consider equality with God to be something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking on the nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, and being found in the appearance of a man. He humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. And I love what Paul's saying here. He's like, hey, in your relationships with other people, try to be like Jesus. And he's like, to remind you what Jesus is like, he laid everything down for the sake of others. He put their interests ahead of his own. So when we think of that question, like, how can I grow my relationships? Be humble. And humility isn't thinking less of yourself. It's just thinking of yourself less. You guys have probably heard that. C.S. Lewis has said that. Others have said that. It's just, hey, I need to be more concerned about you than I am with me. Yes. And if you have that posture, your relationships will get better.
Yeah, I think humility in relationships will lead you to serving them. And if you're in that posture of serving others, your relationships will improve. Humility, I think, leads to serving. I think you'll be bad at serving if you struggle with humility.
That's really good.
I just think you want to focus on one thing, focus on this. And I love that. It's not that humility is not having insecurity or thinking of yourself in a low, like thinking badly of yourself. It's saying, you know, I'm going to be more like Jesus. Jesus came to serve, not to be served. And he was the ultimate leader, and he was our model for relationships. And he came in low as a servant. He washed feet. He cared for people. He stopped for the one. He wasn't in a hurry. He saw people. And so if you want to grow in one thing, and you're like, I want to improve in one thing, focus on humility and say, you know what? How can I think of myself less and be outward focused? And in doing that, I think that there'll be synergy there. A lot of times the person in the relationship, depending on the relationship, will match. And if you're married in the room, like this this will be a huge help. If you are married and you're like, I'm feeling frustrated, I'm feeling friction, and you're like, what should I do? I think just start here. Just start, how can I serve my spouse? How can I just love them through lifting them up, whether it's through prayer, through acts of service, whatever that looks like, just putting them first. It will help so much. I think selfishness is like a cancer to your relationship. If not treated, I think it grows and causes more problems. And so just identifying yourself, like, how can I grow? And being selfless. It's really like a race to the back of the line. Like, if instead of putting yourself in first place, like, race to the back of the line. And what if your marriages look like that? Like, you're both racing to the back of the line and saying, no, you first. You come before me. And so tune into other people's needs. Put other people above yourself. 1 Corinthians 13 says, love is not self-seeking. And so when we love other people, we're thinking about them above ourselves. And so, yeah, I love that. I love that question so much. What's one thing? I'd say humility.
I think, removing the mirror and stop thinking about yourself and like looking into the lives of others. How can I love them? How can I serve them? Trying to shift that lens to being on yourself less and focusing more on others is so helpful. Well, there's a leader who we listen to often, and he always says, when you walk into a room, don't think, here I am, think, there you are. Like, the best people to be around are the ones who walk into the room and they're like, there you are. Like, they're there for other people. And if you can adopt that posture in any of your relationships, it's going to be a huge help.
So good. All right. Next question. Question number 3 says, what do you do when you feel caught in a cycle of being frustrated with someone? Is anybody relating to this? Like, sometimes.
No, I've never been.
You've never been frustrated?
No.
I love that for you. Listen, sometimes this is reality. You feel frustrated with somebody, and I don't know whoever wrote this question, I don't know if this is, your spouse, your coworker, your friend, your neighbor. So we're going to speak generally, but what do you do when you're caught in a cycle of being frustrated with someone? I think there's many reasons you could be frustrated with somebody, but I think one of the first things I would encourage you to evaluate in your frustration is your expectations. A lot of times we find frustration in relationships because we have expectations for the relationship or for the person that are not being met. Unmet expectations, unexpressed expectations, unrealistic expectations are all a pathway to frustration, to bitterness, to offense. And so communication and expectation is really important. And when you're like in a relationship that you're frustrated with, like focus on this, focus on how am I communicating and what are my expectations in this relationship. I think that will help with your frustration. So we kind of want to talk about those different types of expectations that we put on people and dive a little deeper into that.
Totally. I mean, before we even jump into that, there's this moment where John the Baptist is in prison. And I'll read it. Matthew 11, 2 and 3 says, when John, who was in prison, heard about the deeds of the Messiah, he sent his disciples to ask him, are you the one who is to come, or should we expect somebody else? And so for those of you who are newer to the Bible or aren't familiar, John the Baptist is, Elizabeth's son. And if you remember the Christmas story, there's Mary and Elizabeth. They're both pregnant. And he's the one who's been declaring that Messiah is coming the whole time. He's always been saying it's Jesus. He's actually already baptized Jesus. He's already been doing all of those things. And he has this moment of like doubt where he's like, sends his guys to go to Jesus and be like, you are the one, right? Or should we expect somebody else? Yeah. And I love that because I think it's just a reminder that when Jesus wasn't exactly showing up the way they expected him to, it caused confusion for John. And I think it does the same for us, is when we have those three things, the unmet, unexpressed, or unrealistic expectations, it can cause problems. So the first one are those unspoken ones.
Yeah, I think you might have an expectation for them to do something that you've never said. Like, they cannot read your mind. And so I want to just encourage you, have you ever said what you're expecting of them? Sometimes I think it's just easy to be offended when we feel like someone could do something for us, but they don't. And so, like, for instance, like, they could write a check to help. They could refer my business to their friends. Like, they could give me a chance. They could let me stay at their house. They could advertise for me. They could visit me when I'm sick. They could give me a discount. They could call me. Like, they could show up. And I think we expect things from others that are sometimes unspoken and unsaid. And that does create frustration in the relationship. We sometimes, even if we're being honest, expect things from others that we don't even do ourselves. And so I would encourage you, like, you're expecting them to call you. Well, maybe you could call them. Or you're expecting them to do something, meet them and do that for them to initiate. Because we expect others to do things sometimes that we aren't even doing ourselves, or we expect people to do things for us because we did something for them. Are you following me? It can go both ways. And so those unspoken expectations, I think, are actually a sign of entitlement in the relationship. And it's something to kind of evaluate, inside of ourselves.
Yeah, I mean, it's not summer yet. I hope you're not wearing sandals. We're stepping on your toes a little bit. Like, the expectations becoming entitlement is huge.
Yeah.
It's the difference between they could do that and they should do that.
Yeah.
Which is really the difference between a desire and an expectation.
Right.
Right? Like, I can want you to do something, but as soon as I expect you to, I no longer appreciate it when you do, and I'm frustrated when you don't.
Yeah.
But if I just want it, if I just desire it, I appreciate it when you do, and I'm not upset when you don't.
Yeah.
The only difference is me wanting to hold you accountable. Desire is great. Expectation will hurt your relationships. Yes. No matter the level of relationship. If it's a grandkid, if it's a coworker, if it's whoever. I mean, there's of course things we can expect from people. Like, there are certain things that people are supposed to do. But in general, the more you have a posture of you don't owe me anything, I have things I want, but you don't owe me, the more you're full of gratitude when things happen, the more you just can appreciate, and you're way more receptive to it. Yeah. Make sure that in your frustration, you're not leaning into too much they should, that you more have that posture of, I would like. Yeah. And it will help. Have those conversations. Make sure this is another thing we say all the time. Yeah. You can't expect what you don't express. This is free marriage counseling.
Yeah, this helps us a lot.
You can't expect what you don't express.
Yeah, like, I would really love for you to take the trash out, and I've expressed that to you. And so now he knows, and he does it. And this helped us so much in our marriage. I don't know where we got this from or who spoke into our lives and
I remember,
helped.
but it's fine.
You do?
It doesn't really matter.
I love that. Okay, well, it's been a part of our...
Yeah, for a long time.
And we say this all the time. We say this to other people. It's just one of those lines that comes up. Like, if we haven't expressed something, that's on us, not on the other person. Because, like, if I haven't expressed to him that I have this need or desire, and how is he supposed to read my mind? Like, he cannot read my mind. And so it's on me to communicate. And so there's some amens happening. I'm just like, I love y'all. Like, some marriages in the room are like, I'm expecting you. It's all good.
But then people want to push back. Like, it's not romantic, though. You're supposed to just read my mind.
You want it to be romantic. You do. You want it to be like, oh, we're so in sync. He already knows. But listen, you need to be realistic and say, I'm going to communicate. I'm going to say my desire. I'm going to say my expectations, because I cannot expect from my husband what I haven't expressed. And this will work in all relationships. Express what you expect. So
the other thing is sometimes expectations are just unmet.
Yeah.
Maybe they have been verbalized, maybe they are clear, but they're still not being met. Yeah. Proverbs 13:12 says, hope deferred makes the heart sick, but a longing fulfilled is a tree of life. Like, there is the reality that sometimes we experience just unmet expectations. Like, hey, that was clear. We talked about it. It still didn't happen. And that's hard. That's just like you go to God with that. You can go back to that person. You come with grace. You come with humility. And you just make sure that you're doing your part consistently. Yeah. And there's also the third category.
Yeah. Okay. The third category is that you might have an unrealistic expectation. It might just be unrealistic. Like maybe you entered the marriage and your unrealistic expectation was that they would never be in a bad mood. Like they would always be happy. Or I don't know what that unrealistic expectation is that you're bringing into a relationship, but you have to be real and evaluate, is this unrealistic? Is this not fair? And so I would say really enter in relationships with empathy and compassion. Like foster that inside of yourself. Really think about the other person and say, you know what, maybe I'm expecting something that is unrealistic. Like maybe they don't have the margin for that in their life. I haven't been in their shoes. Like maybe my perspective on this situation is skewed because from their perspective, what I'm asking is unrealistic. And so I think compassion, empathy really plays in huge here. If you're in a cycle of frustration with a person, evaluate, is my expectation unrealistic? Yeah.
Yeah. Have I communicated it? Is it realistic? Those are great. Come with that humility we just talked about in the last one.
Yep.
But sometimes it moves from frustration to some form of a broken relationship, which is a great segue to our next question. Yeah. Someone wrote in, how do you know if a relationship is able to be reconciled or not? Which is a hard question. The quick answer is sometimes you don't know. We can't see the future. We don't know if it will be reconciled. We spent a week on forgiveness and a week on offense and talking about what Scripture teaches about both of those things. And we are called to forgive. Because forgiveness we can do on our own. You can work through that. You can forgive somebody, release that, give that to God. Reconciliation involves the other person. So you can only do as much as you can. Paul, in one of his letters in the New Testament, he talks about doing everything you're able to live at peace with others. And I like the freedom that's in that, where it's there's our part where it's you're doing everything you can, but he's leaving allowance for the fact that there's some of that is outside of our control. You don't know how people will respond. So reconciliation is kind of separate from forgiveness in that it's that final restoration. It's that removal of an offense where there's peace, where there was once a lack of peace, where there's enmity, and we desire it. And so my quick answer to you would be, you don't know for sure, but you always want to leave that door open. You want to do everything you can on your side to say, if the proper steps are taken, if we can work through this, if the things that need to be done are done, there is a pathway back to relationship.
Yeah, and really we see the most beautiful picture of reconciliation between God and how we're reconciled to God through Jesus Christ. And so that gives us hope, we were reconciled to God in our sin because of Jesus. And so I believe, I'm a hope-filled person. I'm always it can be reconciled. But it's true, you don't know. But I think just do your part in it. I think that way you won't live in regret and just say, what's my part in this? And ask God for his grace and help and clarity and discernment. And just, it's a beautiful picture, that reconciliation between us and God is complete and perfect. And so we believe that to be true also in our relationships through the power of God. And so I love that question. And you can really only know and control your end. And so I feel this question, the heaviness in that. And I just want to speak to whoever wrote this question, you know what? God's not finished. If you're in a relationship that there is pain and distance and it's not what you thought and there's hurt, I just want to speak to that person and say, you know what? God's not done with this story. And I've heard of crazy testimonies of God really turning around relationships, miracles happening, people coming back and finding real hope and healing. And so I believe that for you, and I hope that you just look to the Lord and allow him to speak, into that situation. And so yeah, great question.
I love that too, and I loved your point of God reconciles us to him through Jesus. Paul says that in almost every book in the New Testament, in Romans and Ephesians, and all these places where he talks about how God came to us, and through Jesus we're reconciled to God. And that's a perfect example of it. Yes, and so in our own interpersonal relationships, we desire that. And I think you have to ask yourself, which side of this am I on? Yeah. Was I the one who messed up in a large way? I need to go to them humbly asking for forgiveness, and you can only do your part. If they hurt you, expressing you still desire a relationship and that you've forgiven them, and a lot of times it's somewhat mutual. Most of the time, there's things that both of you can own in a relationship to work towards it. And so I think it leads to kind of like a part 2 of this question of what somebody else wrote in.
Yeah, someone else said, like, how do you relate to those who seem to keep their distance from you? And so there's strain in the relationship, right? How do you relate to those people who are like maybe putting up walls in the relationship? Like there's distance there, you feel that, and you're like, all right, what's my part? Like, how do I handle this? I would encourage you to show up consistently, to not be hot and cold in the relationship. You might feel inclined to do that because there's probably pain there. Like if they've put up walls or distance themselves from you, there's hurt, right? And so our like natural defense mechanism would be to match that and say, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to put walls up, and as soon as they are ready to come back, you're like, oh no, like you match what has already the treatment that you've already been given. And so I want to encourage you, be consistent, show up, treat them how you want to be treated. I think the golden rule will help so much with this. If you're reaching out and staying warm and open when someone's ready to come back, I think that's really important. I think it's good to remember that there are people in counseling probably because of you. And so you have to own your part. Like you have to get real and say, what, I'm not perfect. Maybe there's a part that I need to own in this, and be open and willing to hear it. Come in humility again. I would say love in a way that they will receive it. And so really seek to understand whoever this person is that has kept distance from you. Seek to understand them and say, how are they going to feel loved by me? What's going to feel like love to them? And own your part. I think sometimes what's intended and what's experienced are not always the same thing.
Yeah, unpack that a little bit.
Yeah, I think we come with good intentions, and sometimes we're like, well, that's not what I meant. Like, how did that hurt you? Of course I didn't mean that. And you may have had the best intentions, but maybe the way they experienced you was not what you intended. Okay, and so there might need to be healing, and you might need to own that and say, what, I'm so sorry that happened. I'm so sorry. I just own it. I'm sorry I said that. I'm sorry that hurt you. I did not mean for that to happen. Own your part, and it will really help. And I think sometimes when people are distant from you, it is because of something maybe that you need to own. And so own your part and evaluate how other people on the other side of you are experiencing yourself. This comes in like you need self-awareness. Grow in self-awareness. It will help your relationships.
Yeah, I think, seeking to understand more than to be understood. If there's distance in the relationship, do everything you can to find out why they're upset. I'm not a psychologist. You're not either. We have taken counseling classes. But if you were to talk to somebody who's a therapist or a counselor, most of the time they will tell you if there's distance and walls up, there's some amount of way they've been hurt or traumatized, not even necessarily by you, but it could be reminding them of another situation. Yeah. And so you need to create a safety for them to come out from that wall and remove the wall. And so in order to do that, you need to understand. A lot of times they'll deflect too. They'll make it about something else. Create a space where they're willing and open because they actually think you want to know. Let them know, I'm willing to hear it, even if it's painful. I want to know because I care about this relationship enough that I'm willing to just hear what you have to say. I want to know how I hurt you. That's not my intention. I want to restore and reconcile. And again, you can only own your part.
You can only own your part. And I want to say, too, like, there's an aspect of this. I like this question because there's an earnestness to help the relationship in this question. And I want to encourage you too, like, you have to be willing to work at relationships. Like, you got to be willing to have some resolve around it. I mean, there are situations where the relationship is not, like, there's going to be distance and there's nothing you can do about it. There's release that might need to happen. But I want to say, like, don't be lazy in a relationship. Oh, they're just, like, giving distance. They'll come back around and you forget and you're flippant and careless. That's not the way. Like, let's be thoughtful and put some work in and say, you know what, how can I improve? What can I learn from this? How can I prevent this in the future? If you're consistently having people who put up walls with you, like if this is a trend in your relationships, take note and do some work and like get your work gloves on and say, you know what, I'm gonna get in counseling. I'm gonna figure out why this keeps happening. Why is there this cycle that people put up walls with me, and get in there and like figure out what's happening. And so I love that question. All right, next question. This one's for you, Pastor Dan.
All right.
How do you submit to authority even when you disagree with them? This is assuming it's not causing you to sin. Like your boss gives you orders that you believe to be the wrong decision. Like, how do you submit to authority when you disagree?
All right. Yeah.
Great question.
I, unlike a lot of people, do actually like the word submit the more I've studied it. You know, I think in our culture, none of us like that. We're like independent. We don't want to submit to anybody. I have a lot of people I'm submitted to in my life. Actually, in Ephesians chapter 5, it says to submit to one another. And we've been talking about the one another's in this series. Like, submission is something we're supposed to do. And I think the reason I've learned to like it, and this is just a tangent. This isn't in our notes or anything either, really. Yeah. The reason I've learned to like it is I've realized it's attached to blessing. In any area that the Bible talks about submission, it almost always has some form of blessing attached to it. Because if you make it a little broader too, of like honor and obey, or any of those passages we know or learn as kids, or different things, there's always some sort of blessing or promise or something that God wants to give you through that. I mean, 1 Peter talks about this. He's talking about all these different things going on, and 1 Peter's written in a time of, like, Caesar is murdering Christians, lighting them on fire, hanging them from trees. It's a horrible thing. And he's yet saying, honor the emperor, honor the king, like, submit to authority. And it's like, how can you write that, Peter, like, in this cultural moment when people hate us, they don't treat us well, and he actually says to do it. He sneaks in this little phrase in 1 Peter, for God's sake, for the sake of the Lord. And that's a hard passage for me to read. I like that the person who wrote this, like, put in the caveat, like, assuming they're not making you sin. Of course, if the thing they're asking you to do is morally wrong, don't do it. Like, it reminds me of the book of Acts, where they're like, are we to submit to you or to God? Like, ultimately, you're submitted to God. So you're going to do what he says no matter what, period. Like, end of story. Like, Daniel and his friends, they're like, we're not bowing down to the idol. If you grew up on VeggieTales, we're not bowing down to the bunny. Like, they're like, we won't submit, because ultimately they're submitted to God. But if you're ultimately submitted to God and the person in that given situation is in authority, then submitting to God also means submitting to them. Like, that's clearly taught in Scripture. A caveat on the husbands, wives things, like, if you grew up in a situation where you're taught only wives submit, like, I encourage you, really read that chapter.
Maybe we should talk about it sometime.
We should talk about it sometime. But
yeah, let's do that.
We're all called to submit to each other,
yeah,
and also to our leaders, and also to governing authorities and all those things. But to answer that question more directly, when you're asked to do something, if it's not morally wrong, I would say talk to that person to the extent that relationship allows. So if you have influence, if you have their ear, go to them and say, hey, this is the reason, I don't see it this way. Are you willing to talk about it more? And, we've had this experience, with a leader or a boss who are like, hey, I don't know if, like, I would do it that way. Here's why. I want to hear from your perspective why you're choosing that, and if you're willing to, I'd love to share my perspective why I disagree. And then ultimately, still just I honor their decision. Like, because I know I'm submitted ultimately to God who's asking me to do that. It's an uncomfortable answer in our culture. But I think ultimately you just trust God. Hey, if this isn't morally wrong, God, you've placed me in this position. If it's something that regularly happens, like this person wrote in, like their boss, if it's something that's happening all the time with your boss, maybe you should look for a new job. Just like you and your boss don't see things the same way. But if it's a sometimes thing, because if we're never willing to do the thing that we're unwilling to do, we're not actually ever submitted in the first place. Like we've just been doing what we were okay with.
Right. You're not really a follower if you're only willing to do it they say when you agree. I think it's important to know, what, sometimes I might not see it the same way. Submission really just means under mission. And so can you be under their mission? Can you say, I'm on mission with you. I'm on the same team with you. I might not agree with every little thing. Like my boss might be going in a direction or making a decision that I don't agree with, but I'm on the same team. Like I'm on mission with you. And I would say, can we just get real practical? You come to your boss and you say, I don't see this the same way. You have this conversation and your boss says, well, actually, we're going to just keep, this is why I chose this. We're going to do this. Can I just say, don't make them pay. Don't, like, if you're under a leadership and they're going, and it's not sin, okay, we've already established that, and they're going in a direction and it's not what you agree, I would say don't make them pay for it. Don't gossip and talk to everybody else about why you didn't agree with your leader's decision, and not everybody else knows, and you've created disunity and gossip, and it's toxic when we do that, you guys. Don't make your leaders pay when they're going in a direction that you don't agree with. I think submission is really, I think there's sowing and reaping here. I love that principle. Like what you sow into whatever situation it is what's going to be reaped back out. And so if you're sowing discord, you will reap discord. If you're sowing disunity, you will reap that. If you're sowing lies, that's what you will reap. And so if in the future you're a boss, I just want to say, just be intentional about your actions, even post conversation, when you're disagreeing with somebody, because it matters so much. I think don't whisper to everybody about how you weren't on board. I don't think that's actually submission. That's not submitting.
That's great.
You're saying, I disagree, and it's not submission. You're on your own team, and so.
If you're like, I don't think that's going to work, and then later you're like, I told you.
That's not. Ooh, that's rough.
Just be all in. Be a good teammate. Be a good follower.
Yeah.
I think we will always move at the speed of our unity. I think we're called to unity. I think we're supposed to be people that work to build bridges. And we could talk about that for a long time.
I know. All right, let's move on.
Yeah. Question
number 6. How do you practically love your enemy?
Another heavy one.
Ooh.
All right. Matthew 5:44 says, but I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you.
Yeah. Pray for them.
This is Jesus talking.
Yeah. This is Jesus talking. I know. And it's like that. Take that into account. Like he had enemies that were trying to kill him, and did end up killing him. And so when he says, pray for those who are against you, prayer will not only change the situation, but it will change you. And so a great first step that you can do immediately is just implement prayer. I think it will change you and it will change the situation because I believe in the power of prayer. And I would say bless them, don't curse them. Use your words wisely. And so if you have an enemy in your life, somebody who you categorize as that, pray for them. And then forgive them. Number 2 is forgive.
Yeah.
You want to talk about that?
Yeah, I think sometimes we talked about this in our forgiveness message. Like if we forgive somebody, we're like letting them off the hook. Yeah. We're like, well, but if I forgive them, like, how are they going to, it's just, we're choosing to put it in God's hands. Yeah. We're saying, God, vindication is yours, like justice is yours. I'm called to forgive as I've been forgiven, and I'm going to trust you with the outcome, trusting that you'll make it right, that you'll do what you see you fit. And then in loving them, be creative in love. Like read all those passages that talk about what love is, and then look at Jesus' life. What did it look like for him to love his enemies? It doesn't always mean, like he still said what he disagreed with, and he still did those things. But he did it with compassion, with invitation.
I I think like loving your enemies is really something that sets us apart as Christians. Like if you're a believer in the room, this is like the thing that we're called to do that will look really different than the rest of the world. If other people have enemies, they are cut off and canceled and eliminated from that person's life. But the calling for us as Jesus followers is to actually love our enemies, which is a high call. And so I think the remembering that this is what God has done for us and having that perspective in mind and really looking for the good of others even when they don't for you. And so ask God to really love people through you.
I think that's a great takeaway, is letting God love people through you. Corrie ten Boom is, if you know that story, family taken by Nazis, and she's like, how do I love? And praying, God, will you love them through me? And I think the easiest way to love your enemies, the easiest way to work through all of these questions is somebody who's distant, somebody who's hurt you, somebody who you're constantly frustrated with, is God love through me? I need to constantly remain connected to the vine, to the source, to receive what I need in order to offer it freely. There's an author who talks about this regularly, and they say, keep your love on. The only way to keep your love on is to keep that tap open and say, God, you're working in me and through me. I can't do this on my own. I need you to actively love through me. All right, last question as we wrap up. How do I have a good conversation with somebody who's new? How do I have a conversation without it being awkward?
Let's go. I love this. This is so practical. Don't even be in here and act like you don't need this. Like, come on, you guys. We all can improve our conversations. We all have awkward conversations with people, like interactions. Not even, we'll maybe talk about the church context, but just anywhere. Like, there's weird conversations. Okay, so let's talk about it. How do you have a conversation without it being awkward with somebody that you don't know?
Yeah, love them. And the way people want to be loved is they want to be known.
Yeah.
Everybody in here wants to be known.
Yes.
To like the appropriate amount, right? So it's like, if you want to have a good conversation,
yes.
ask good questions.
Yes.
Like the better questions you ask, the better the conversation will be.
Yeah.
Like keep trying to make it about them. Ask them what they're up to, what they care about.
Yeah.
All of those things.
Yeah, you want to know something that everybody wants to talk about? Themselves. Like everybody will talk about themselves. And so just a tip, stay really curious about other people. Just be curious, because people will most of the time be willing to talk about themselves. And so if you can get just good at asking questions, I think that's the number one way to improve conversations is stay curious, ask good questions. Asking a stranger, how are you, will usually end in one word. Like they'll say good, and they might not be good, but that's like culturally, that's what we say. Good, how are you? Good. And then like, you're like, what else are we gonna talk about? Like that was all I had. And so here's a tip. Did you already say this? Come with some questions. Okay, so something that is helpful is to just have a couple questions in the back of your mind. Like just in your toolbox, like these are questions I ask, and maybe it's like real specific, like what were you excited about this week? Tell me like what got you excited this week, or ask whatever. Think of some really good questions and ask other people. And I would say don't be afraid to go beyond the surface. Don't be nosy, but I think a lot of people are actually more comfortable with going deeper than we give them credit for. Like if I just asked you, like maybe you are even like, I love those kind of more meaningful conversations. Like that's me. I can talk about the weather, but I love to just go a little under the surface and say, you know what, what's really going on? Like how is that relationship going? How is that like work thing going? And sometimes we just need to give people a little more credit and say, you know what, I think we're willing to go below the surface, go a little bit deeper. And so like, don't be worried about that. If somebody doesn't want to go deep, I think they'll let you know. You'll pick up on that. And so go deep and ask good questions. I think also be a good listener. If you ask them a question and then they can tell that you are not listening, that will also kill the conversation and make it awkward. And so be a good listener. Really listen to what they are saying to you, and then your follow-up question will come through what they just shared. And so I know you're like, this is so basic, but like a lot of people don't have this skill. Like this is like, we need like to grow in this, being good at conversations. Like a lot of times we're communicating through screens. And so I want to be good at this. I want our church to be good at this, so that we're like getting below the surface and getting to know people.
Yeah.
What else would you add?
Yeah, I liked what you said is like, I think most people are willing to go deeper than we think they will.
Yeah.
We're worried it will make it super awkward. And if you sense it's getting weird, like, abort mission, like go a little shallower. Like, hey, I'm going too far too fast. But like some people are willing to do it. Just the other day, I ran to the grocery store that's close to our house because I needed one thing. I was going for one thing. And then I came home and Abigail was like, why were you gone so long? Yeah. Like you needed one thing. And I was like, I got in 2 long conversations with people I didn't know. Like one of them was the person at the checkout. Yeah. I was like, how's it going? And she's like, she made like one of those like medium responses. And I was like, in my head, I'm like, are we going there or not? Like, I'm like, let's do it. And I was like, tell me more about that. Like, why that? And then we started having this long conversation about this other customer she had that was like really upsetting to her. And yeah, we just chatted. And she was like willing to tell me all of these things she was feeling. And she's like talking about, I might quit my job and like all of these things. And I was like, I don't know, maybe don't do that. Like it's one person. And, we chatted for a while. But it's just like, if you're just willing to like acknowledge the fact that somebody like cracked the door open and like open it a little bit, they're willing to talk to you. So if you want to have good conversations, ask good questions, be curious.
Be curious. Okay, great questions, you guys. Thanks so much for submitting them. I hope that this series has encouraged you and inspired you to really improve your people skills and relationships. The reason why we talked about this for 8 weeks is because it matters so much to God. He takes it personally, how we treat other people. And so our challenge kind of to you at the end of this series is maybe pick one thing to focus on. Maybe it's to work on not being offended. Maybe it's to work on encouragement. Maybe like today we talked about humility. Like maybe just pick one thing and say, from this series, I'm going to focus on this one thing and I want to see how it improves my relationships. And so you can go back and listen if you missed any of the messages. And really, I believe that as we become better in our relationships, not only will our relationships be better, but we'll also reflect Jesus more accurately to the world around us. And so it just matters. And so let's be good at relationships. Let's love people well in the way that we've been loved.
Yeah, that's so good. And I mean, in some ways, this can be so helpful and so practical. In other ways, you're like, this doesn't seem as deep as sometimes. Like, I'm ready for deeper. Well, we'll go deeper. We have a new series coming up next week. We're going to do Summer in the Psalms. It's going to be great. But also, I want to just remind you that this actually, like Abigail said, really matters to God. In Matthew 25, he talks about separating the sheep and the goats. And he all of a sudden, Jesus in this teaching is like, actually, some of you have like loved me and given me water and done these things. And they're like, when did we see you, Jesus? And he's like, whatever you've done for the least of these, you've done for me. Which I think is just a reminder that God does take relationships so personally. Yeah. That Jesus intentionally says the greatest command is love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. But the second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. That we need to seriously consider what the Bible talks about love and how to care for the people around us because God cares about it. Like you said, it's the way we reflect him to the world. But the most important relationship we can have is our one with God. And Jesus did put that first. Love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Like we mentioned earlier, the Bible talks about being reconciled to God. The whole reason we need to be reconciled is because we're the ones who messed up the relationship. We did things that were outside of what he said we should do. The Bible calls it iniquity or sin or transgression. And basically all that means is you did something that God said you shouldn't have done. And because of that, there is a rift in that relationship. But he loves us so much that he sent Jesus, his one and only son, to die for us, to be raised again on the third day, to fulfill all the prophecy in the Old Testament so that we could put our trust in him and be reconciled to God. So if you've never done that, get that relationship right first. Yeah. Come to God and ask for forgiveness. Ask for him to put his spirit inside of you. It's a free gift that you're invited to. And saying, God, I need to be reconciled to you. Thank you for making a way for that. I ask that you'd forgive me, make me brand new, fill me with your spirit. I want to live for you. And when you do that, when you pray that in your own words, you begin a new relationship with God. He puts his Spirit inside of you and everything changes.